Alrighty, hi everybody, and welcome to our first Hot Topic event of the semester. My name is Emma, and I'm your host for today's Hot Topic Fact or Fiction Astrology event. I am a student event planner who works as part of the tri-institutional team between MSU, CCD, and UCD. I attend CU Denver, and I am in my senior year. Joining us today are two panelists who will be discussing the facts and fictions behind astrology and astronomy. We are lucky enough to welcome panelist Steffanie Peterson from the Community College of Denver and panelist Kamran Sahami from Metropolitan University, who will both introduce themselves in just a few minutes. We have questions already set to ask the panelists, but we will also be accepting questions from you, the viewers. Throughout the events, you'll be able to submit your question to me to ask the panelists in the comment section. So if you have any questions, put those in the comment section and we will be looking for them. If you enjoy the event, we will be giving more information on the upcoming hot topics this semester at the end. We also want to acknowledge that this is a safe space, and although we may have differing opinions on the topic, we will respect all views. Now, without further delay, here are our panelists. Speakers, if you would please introduce yourself and your institution, and give us a quick overview about your research, what you teach, and anything else about your background that you feel might be relevant. Steffanie, would you mind getting us started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Steffanie Peterson. I teach physics and astronomy at the Community College of Denver. I have been teaching there for about 7 or 8 years, and I really love teaching the astronomy, especially a new course that we started, Astronomy of Ancient Cultures. There's actually a lot of crossover with astrology, as I'll show, Western astrology anyways, as I'll show when we get started. And I also teach physics. I'm sorry, what were the questions?
Just give a little bit about your background, introduce your institution, and any little tidbit that you feel might be relevant.
Okay, yeah. So my background is interesting as far as physics and astronomy goes because I actually have a bachelor's degree in liberal arts, and then I transitioned into applied physics from there. And so I really love this topic because I like talking about the human side of science, and astrology and astronomy have a really interesting shared history that I like talking about. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Kamran, are you ready?
Hi, my name is Kamran Sahami. I'm a physics and astronomy professor at Metropolitan University. I've been working there since 2004 as a physics professor. I got my PhD at CU Boulder in astrophysical planetary and atmospheric sciences in 2000. And the research that I do at Metro, I do some research at CU Boulder, but the research I do at Metro is in partnership with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And we had 2 NSF grants working on astronomy education, specifically using the Gates Planetarium and looking at the effects of immersion in students building their cognitive understanding of not just astronomy, but of spatial relationships and so on. So the research I do at Metro centers around astronomy education.
Yeah, thank you. Both sounds very interesting. So thank you both for introducing yourselves. We're going to get into the questions now, and we're going to give about 2 to 5 minutes per each question. Steffanie, the first question will be directed to you, but Kamran, please feel free to elaborate. So Steffanie, what are the common roots between astronomy and astrology?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got some really nice pictures to show some of the common things between them.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Are you able to see the slide that I put up?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, so just to start with the terminology, the root is very similar. It deals with the stars, and one is arranging and kind of one is the telling of the stars. And the thing that they have in common is that astrology and astronomy both use careful observation of the sky, measurements of positions, tracking motion of things like the moon, the sun, the planets, the stars, and looking at it in the sky with respect to the horizon. and collecting this information, organizing it, and recognizing patterns. And so some of the images that I have here are the instruments that people have used over the years. There's the astrolabe down here. What is this called again? Armillary sphere up here. This is actually taken from a new armillary sphere that was implemented down in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this is a replication of the Antikythera device that was found in the ocean, and it was actually used to predict eclipses. And then this is a sextant used for measuring positions of things relative to the horizon. And some of the things that we look for are the daily motions. And so this is actually a sundial here in Denver. It's at a park kind of west of downtown. I can't remember the name of the park. It's like Observatory Park or something like that. It's not on one of the campuses. It's just a park downtown, east of downtown Denver, sorry. Mm-hmm. And then this would be a way to measure time at night, watching the stars kind of go around. And we can also see over the course of the day relative to the horizon, the sun moves up and down. And then we can measure, we can make calendars using the moon, the phases of the moon. And this is an image from Chimney Rock. And so there's a really nice viewing site that the ancient Puebloans used to view the lunar standstill, for example, of the moon, which marked a significant part of time. And then over the course of a year, we can measure things with constellations like the Pleiades, and we can get this interesting pattern of the position of the sun in the sky. And of course, the famous, in Western astrology, we have the famous zodiac, and this is the path that the sun appears to take through the sky over the course of the year. And I think that's all that I have for that question. So that's...
Yeah, those are really cool images. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share.
Yeah. All right, Cameron, now we have a question for you. How would you differentiate between astronomy and astrology? So this is kind of on the opposite end of the question that we asked Steffanie.
Well, they shared a common lineage if you go back about 3,000, 2,000 years ago, looking up at the stars and recognizing patterns, as Steffanie pointed out, is where they started. But they diverged relatively quickly. The biggest difference between astronomy and astrology is that one adheres to the scientific method. One uses this process of hypothesis, testing an observation, revising that hypothesis very often, and developing a complete theory. And the other really doesn't go through that same level of rigor. So if I were to answer it in one sentence, it may actually be the topic of our panel discussion. Astronomy is a science and astrology is not. That might be the most concise way to differentiate them.
Yeah, thank you. So now going off that, I have a question for both of you. Oh, did you want to add something, Steffanie?
Yeah, one thing that I like to add is just to clarify the goal of each one. The goal of astrology is to use the patterns and positions of the planets among the stars in order to predict or foretell events in human affairs or to describe human characteristics. And using the scientific method, we haven't really seen any strong correlation between those two. Whereas with astronomy, the goal of astronomy is to determine the composition, the origin of, for example, the sun and the planets, and the motion and the cause of the motion of objects in the sky, in space.
So going off what both of you just said about the differences, do you each think that they can be compatible or no?
Yeah, I don't see a compatibility issue. And, I see astronomy as a science. It's what I've chosen to do with my life and many of my colleagues. And I don't really see them in opposition if that's done contextually. If we talk about, what does astronomy do and what does astrology do? I don't see them any more compatible or any less compatible than, say, science or science fiction. Very often they'll feed off each other. One will inspire the other and so on and so forth. But if you live your life according to the tenets of science fiction, it may not be beneficial for you. Just like, if you understand, for instance, virology, or you understand chemistry or biology or physics or something like that, you might be able to build a better bridge. You might be able to do, useful and meaningful research and so on. But, if you choose to follow the ways of the Jedi, or pray to the Cylon God, it just may not be as useful, but it is far more entertaining. So one might have its own domain, as Stephen Jay Gould said, non-overlapping magisteria, right? One will have its own domain and it's absolutely compatible with this other domain.
Yeah, thank you. Steffanie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think as long as the claims that you're making about each pursuit are clear, and if you're making claims about the natural world or human characteristics and human affairs, that you follow the rules of science. But the overlap between them, as far as the sky watching, the data collection and organization, making the instruments, making predictions of where the planets or the sun is going to be in the sky during a certain time. Those are all good ways that they can overlap.
Yeah, thank you. So now we're going to take a little bit of a different direction. So this question's for you, Steffanie.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define the stars, the moons, and the planets?
So that's a great question. And going off of the scientific perspective, which is that a star is a dense ball of gas. It's actually in a plasma state, and it's formed by the collapse of a cloud of gas and dust. It generates energy by fusion in its core. And some of the older stars, as they're dying, they fuse in other places in the star as well, not necessarily just the core. And we go into this in a lot of detail in our Astronomy 102 class. We look all about stars, the definition of stars, the life cycle of stars, the characteristics of stars. And when a star dies, it turns into either a white dwarf, a neutron star, or a black hole. What was the rest of the question?
The moons and the planets.
Yeah, so the moon's a natural satellite, and the moons of other planets that we found, most of them formed at the same time as the planet, but some have been captured. But they're all a natural body that's orbiting a planet. And then the definition of a planet is a relatively large object. It gives off infrared radiation, so we can see it in the infrared. It also reflects visible light. And there was an interesting update to the definition of a planet back in 2006, which got Pluto kicked off the list.
I was just about to ask you. I feel like I remember the definition between planets and moons changing a little bit, which is why Pluto got kicked out.
Yeah, Pluto got its own category now. So it honestly never should have been there, in my opinion, based on the characteristics of Pluto. I know this is very controversial because Pluto was discovered in the US and people are very fond of Pluto as a planet, but it's still there. It's a dwarf planet, but yeah, it's more like a comet. It never should have been on the planet list in the first place.
Oh, poor Pluto.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So Cameron, do you feel that the stars, the moons, or the planets affect our daily life here on Earth?
Well, certainly the planet Earth and its natural sphere does affect our daily lives, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and so on and so forth. Its rotation rate relative to the sun, that, night and day, that certainly affects our lives. So, this is true, but the notion that perhaps the positions of these things or the classical attributions that we give them, for instance, like, Venus having to do with love, for instance, because it was named for the Greek god of love 2,500 years ago. I don't believe the location of Venus will tell anyone anything about their relationships. If you actually look at Venus, it's something out of Dante's Inferno, right? I'm not sure you can associate it with love all that much. I mean, it's not red like Mars, but, it literally has, pools of molten metal and, boiling, seething pools of acid on the surface. So, it may not, or it does not have the attributes that are classically associated with it. One of the things that you hear when you look at sort of astrology in the 20th century, it's sort of modern sense, is this idea that gravity, the position of these planets, does exert a gravitational force on everything else. Of course, gravity can't be shielded. So, people will talk about, well, isn't there a different force on a child when he's born, or the womb of the mother, if, Jupiter and Saturn are over on this side, and as opposed to, Mars and so on this side. And you could actually show that is an effect, with Newtonian gravity. But, the relationship, a bus passing the hospital when a child is born actually has a significantly larger gravitational effect than the position of Jupiter. Now, a bus is a lot smaller, but it's a lot closer. And, so there often is this desire to use gravity as a mechanism to say, well, if gravity can't be shielded and it's ever present, wouldn't it have an effect on an unborn child or a child that's being born, and so on and so forth, with physical forces? And you see a lot of that, especially in justification for Western astrology, starting at around the middle of the 19th century. But, just a really simple calculation. I typically do this with my students in their class, your relationship to the Flatirons, or whether a bus went by the hospital, or there was actually a Finnish astronomer, Niels Moltensen, who came up with this thing called tramology. He lived in Helsinki, and in Helsinki, they had a very regular tram schedule. So I remember hearing about this when I was a kid. I think he came up with it in the 70s and something like that. But by knowing when a child was born in Helsinki, knowing the time and the day, he would know where the trams were. And he would do this, this demonstration that he would show that the position of the trams would exert about 1,000 times the gravitational force of the position of the planets. So, yes, gravity, can't be shielded. It is an effect. And that's the type of discussion you often have with astrologers. But it has not had a causal relationship. And in terms of, people's behavior, the only place where you see that is the work done by psychologists. When someone is told over and over that they're a Scorpio, and Scorpios behave this, or, something happens in your life and, oh, that's so Scorpio, there seems to be this aspect of reinforcement of that type of behavior. And this is really sort of where I've experienced the effects of astrology. I recall having a student in my class, I'm using Scorpio as an example, who was very invested in being a Scorpio. It was their email name. They had this just awesome tattoo of the constellation of Scorpio. It's one of the most amazing tattoos I've ever seen.
That's a good constellation. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. I mean, it had the red Antares and everything,
Nice.
The claws, and it had the old Delaire artwork, for the classical artwork that's superimposed onto that. And unfortunately, in my class, she learned that the sun wasn't in Scorpio when she was born. And it was actually in another constellation called Ophiuchus, which isn't part of the traditional Greek 2,000-year-old zodiacal constellations. And this had a tremendous effect on her. And I was really, taken, not aback, but I was, it moved me quite a bit. So we would have a lot of conversations during office hours about, how your life is still your life. And perhaps you even have more agency now because your life isn't defined by these balls of gas in the sky. So, yeah, I do believe astrology.
It's really interesting that you bring up the psychological aspect of that.
Yeah, I think that's the real effect of astrology and the reinforcement, positive or negative, that comes from, being told you're a Leo, or being told you're a Scorpio or a Libra, or, living in a household that values that and becomes part of your creed. I think that certainly is a real effect.
Yeah, thank you. Steffanie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, but what was the question again?
It was if you thought the stars, the moons, or the planets affected our daily life here on Earth.
Oh, yeah. And as we already covered, the rotation of the Earth, the rising and setting of the sun, that definitely has an effect on human behavior for sure. The moons and the tides definitely seem to have an effect on life on Earth. And I would say I actually really love seeing Venus in the sky in the morning, so that when I wake up and look out my window, I can see it kind of to the east as a morning star. And so that puts me in a good mood. So I guess that kind of is an effect.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So if either of you are familiar with this, can you tell us what role Isaac Newton had in disproving astrology and promoting astronomy in the late 1600s?
Well, Steffanie, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll start. So first of all, I would say that he didn't really disprove astrology. So one of the things that I caution my students against is using the term proving. That's a very mathematical term. If we know the axioms and we know if it's kind of a self-contained system, we can talk about proving things. But in science, the best we can do is showing that it's not false and constantly testing it. These tests of falsification, if it's not falsified, that's good enough. And that's a little strange for people to wrap their heads around with science. So disproving is a little too strong of a word that I would use for it. But yeah, so I would say that we haven't seen any correlation between human affairs and positions of the planets among the stars, with, the exception of the sun and maybe the moon. But yeah, so Newton, I would actually even say it started with Kepler, maybe even with Tycho Brahe. He was pretty influential in the search for what we can verify with observation, so that there was kind of a pivot point where we had to match what we predicted with what we observed. And so Kepler changed the orbital paths of the planets to be elliptical instead of the circles that were assumed, because we assumed the heavens were perfect, and the perfect shape is a circle, and the perfect object shape is a sphere. And so Kepler really showing that we can fit the data very closely, the observation matches very closely if we use this ellipse, showing that we've kind of now changed the standards of matching between our predictions and our observations. And one thing that Newton definitely did was introduce this idea of universal gravitation. And that essentially says that there really isn't a difference between what happens in the heavens and what happens on Earth. They follow the same laws of physics. And so that was a pretty huge shift that Newton gave us, that really helped kind of increase that chasm between astrology and astronomy, and what a science is.
Outer space.
What's that?
By heavens, you just mean outer space.
Yeah. So that was the term that people used for the sky, the things that were moving in the sky.
Yeah, Newton had a really interesting relationship with astrology. It's really interesting because the people for astrology will claim Newton as perhaps their greatest scientific ally, and people who don't believe in astrology will also claim Newton as their greatest scientific ally. So, he will be forever intertwined with the concept of astrology. If we take kind of the pro-astrology side of it first, there's sort of two things one that everyone knows about, and one that really comes from Newton's biographies. Newton came up with his theory of universal gravity. And that's the theory that any mass will exert a force on another mass. And that has become, for about the last 150, 200 years, the fundamental sort of tenet of why astrology works or can work or has an influence, an actual physical influence, a cause and effect. So in that regard, that's, of course, that idea was supplanted in the early 20th century by Einstein, but, still that idea is attributed to Newton. Secondly, in Newton's biography, and his biography was written by it was John Conduit, who was he was the husband of Newton's niece. So he interviewed Newton, he talked to Newton quite a bit. And in one paragraph in that book, and a lot of astrologers will quote this, Newton said that, when he was a student at Cambridge, one of the books that he picked up was this book on astrology, and it inspired him to study the heavens and so on a little bit more. That often gets taken way out of context. And, just 2 paragraphs down, when Newton is talking about, what he did when he graduated and became the Lucasian professor at Cambridge, there's a quote from him that says, I was soon convinced that the vanity and emptiness of the pretend science of astrology. So, folks will sometimes quote that first part, that Newton was inspired by astrology, but they won't sort of, follow up 2 paragraphs down when he said that, he looked into it. And, as far as he was concerned, the position of the planets, and this is the guy who came up with the idea that masses affect each other, don't affect people's lives at all. So, it's interesting. He's such a pivotal and important figure. And it's interesting that he's sort of claimed as sort of a scion by both sides.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I didn't realize that people on the astrology side also quote him as proving.
Yeah, Newtonian gravity, the effect of the gravitational effect, the gravitational pull of the position of the planets on the mother's womb or an unborn child. That's, a big part of the justification of modern astrology.
Yeah, thank you. Steffanie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think that covers it.
All right. So the next question is actually directed to you also, Steffanie. So why do you think people rely on horoscopes and zodiac signs?
Yeah, I think we've already touched on this. I think it's primarily the psychological response. And I've got a couple I can clarify that a little bit more in 2 ways. So the first way is that I think that for the same reason that we rely on spirituality and religion, literature, mythology, arts, even personality tests and online quizzes, because humans are really complicated and endlessly fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just so curious about ourselves. We want to know who we are, what our place in the world is, what our place in the universe is. And I think that zodiac signs and astrology give us that opportunity to reflect on who we are. And so just that natural curiosity about ourselves. And then the other respect is something called bias. And there's in particular 2 types of bias that really work for astrology. Confirmation bias, which we've already touched on, that's just being told something is true, and then you kind of ignore all the evidence to the contrary and only pay attention to the evidence that supports that. And this is something that humans just kind of do naturally. There's a lot of really interesting, if you just Google confirmation bias, there's some really fascinating books out there about how we fool ourselves. And we're just naturally prone to it. And so science, being a social endeavor, helps to kind of uproot some of that bias. The other one is hindsight bias. And this is a little bit more interesting because when you're making predictions about the future, we have this idea that the past is less random than the future. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. And so the idea of telling the future, because we think the past has been unrandomized, I'm not really sure how else to say that, it falls into this category of bias called hindsight bias. And so, yeah, I think it's a kind of a psychological inclination in those ways toward astrology.
I think you bring up a good point on how complicated humans are and how we look towards personality tests or things like that to kind of explain our behaviors. And I think astrology does the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it sort of fits in some basic human needs. I think humans need to believe in something. Humans feel safer when they're told that the world isn't random, that there's sort of a rhyme and reason, and that's understandable. And I think that drives scientists as well. So, and of course, the issue of bias is huge. We will heavily discount things that don't fit our worldview and very tightly latch on to things who do. And that's just, that's just a nature of the beast. That's what and who we are. But yeah, in the case of astrology, I think there's also one other dimension. And that, I think one of the reasons humans do what they do is because it feels good. It's entertainment. It's entertaining. It's far more entertaining to read your horoscope and have something to look forward to that day or that week than it is to do a bunch of calculus problems. It totally is. And again, I don't want to keep going back to the science fiction analogy, but it's the same reason I still watch Star Trek. It feels good.
I think it's a great analogy. No, you can keep going back to it for sure. Yeah. So we have one more question before we're going to move over to the student questions. And this one's for you, Kamran. Do you think that most people believe astrology to be as scientific as astronomy?
I don't think most people do, but I think folks who follow astrology most certainly do. And there's probably a twofold reason for that. One, of course, is its positive confirmation, its confirmation bias. But, that idea of there just being enough science to latch onto, and, which is, again, the law of gravity, Isaac Newton, you see that a lot. But, there's just enough of just enough observation, for instance, for people to believe in a flat Earth. Now, if you go past that incredibly limited horizon, you can start to see that, the evidence on the other side is overwhelming. There's all kinds of things that you can do that, but most people won't do that. They'll just, sort of take one little piece and believe it. So I think the people who are ardent followers of astrology do believe that it has a scientific basis. I think it's expected that most things that we take to be true to have some type of physical, historical, or scientific basis these days. But as far as the general populace, I don't think we're there. Just like we're not there with UFOs, we're not there with the flat Earth and so on. But certainly for a lot of people, yeah, I think they do believe it does have these underpinnings based on the forces of gravity, or based on some unseen forces, which are often invoked. And lately, for instance, I've taught astronomy, I think, most semesters for the last 20 years. And it's really interesting because there's always a couple students that are interested in it, or a couple students who, hold to it as part of a greater belief system. And I think another huge part of that, which I've just observed myself and I'm kind of somewhat puzzled by, is this idea that the government or authorities are lying to people, whether it's about UFOs or, the flat Earth or something like that. But this tendency to, one, not trust the government, two, to adopt some type of alternate explanation, whether it's part of a conspiracy or not. This idea that, people who will tell you that the Earth is round instead of flat have some type of greater agenda. It's surprising, but the number of conversations I've had about astronomy or the fake moon landing and so on, in an incredibly short few steps, in the span of about 10 minutes one-on-one, will eventually get to that particular point. So that's, I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist. My opinion and $1.40 will get you cup of cheap gas station coffee. But it is amazing that it seems to be present in most of these types of discussions. That NASA or the government or someone is just lying to people, and it's up to people to find their own truths. And I'm certainly not going to claim that governments don't lie to people. I think we have ample evidence of that. But these types of conspiracies maybe have re-blossomed again in the internet age.
Yeah, it's really funny you bring up government conspiracies because we actually have an entire Hot Topic event that's going to be dedicated to that later this month.
Yeah, I think Dr. Ben from our department is going to be taking part in the UFOs panel.
Nice. Yeah, but I think you bring up a really good observation during the internet age about how this is kind of resurfaced. I know amongst my generation of millennials that astrology is pretty popular, and I feel like I have a lot of peers who truly believe in it. Yeah. All right, so thank you for your responses so far. Now I'm going to pause in our set questions so we can answer some of our student questions. And both of these will be for either of y'all to answer. So to start, how did reading the stars begin stuff like zodiac signs?
I could take a shot at that. So the zodiac were originally these 12 constellations, these 12 groups of stars. So let's talk a little bit about what a constellation is. A constellation is a group of stars, and different cultures have different groupings. For instance, the zodiacal constellations that we use are the Hellenistic ones. They come to us from the Greeks and the Egyptians as well. A constellation of Orion was really Osiris, and his belt is reflected in the building of the pyramids in Giza and so on. But for instance, if you looked at Eastern cultures, if you look at Mesopotamia, Persia, and China and India, their constellations were more varied. Their constellations were more like a scene. And, like there would be a ship and it would be like 30, 40 stars, or, there would be this sort of mural in the sky. And if you look at the indigenous people of North America and South America, their constellations were smaller. There would be 2 or 3 stars, 1 or 2 stars, it would be a bird or a raven or an orca or, their mythologies. The constellations that we use happen to be the 12 particular groupings of the stars that are on the same plane. It's called the ecliptic plane that the sun and the earth are. So here's the sun, here's the earth going around it. And as we go around it, if you draw a line from the earth to the sun will be in one of these 12, now 13. Ophiuchus is the 13th constellation. It's been there for hundreds of years, but since this stuff was set up 2,500 years ago, it hasn't been updated. So anyhow, that's your sun sign. So when you say, I'm a Scorpio or I'm a Libra, that is the relative position of the Earth to the sun and the stars that would be behind the sun when, the month that you were born. So, these, I think the question was, how does reading the stars sort of with the zodiacal signs began? Yeah. It began with Greek mysticism. Mm-hmm. And
So if it began with Greek mysticism, then there isn't as much of a scientific basis as I thought.
No, but I mean, those constellations in the Western world, and since, it being adopted by the folks who kicked Pluto out, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, there's 88 constellations in the entire global sphere. And there's now 13 of them that lie along the ecliptic plane, which is, where we'll see the sun go as we go around it. So, those, many of them are modern. Like if you look at the stars on the southern sky, you've got the microscope and the whale and the diesel truck. No, I don't think so. I'm not sure that's one of them. But, the ones in the northern hemisphere, because that's where many of the Western cultural roots come from, where people and Eastern cultural roots, more people live in the northern hemisphere because of the landmass disparity. So many of our stories and mythologies are that we project onto the stars, or the stars you see from the northern hemisphere. And the ones in the southern hemisphere are more sort of modern devices. Mm-hmm. Sextants and telescopes and microscopes and things like that.
So there's a lot more astronomical, or there's a lot more constellations than just astrology recognizes?
Yeah, there's about 88 that the IAU has classified, and that covers all the regions of the sky. So that'll cover the whole thing.
And I have a really good visual for this if I could share my screen.
Yeah, of course.
So if you can see the orange line going through the sky, this is the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is the apparent path that the sun makes. And you can see that it's going through Taurus, and as it goes throughout the year, so the daily motion is it rises in the east and sets in the west, which would go left to right across the screen. But the yearly motion is the sun moving toward the left side of the screen. And you can see it goes through Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and then Virgo is the next one over. And so the 12 zodiac signs from Western astrology were originally based on where the sun was and the stars that were behind it, just like we were saying. And you can kind of see that the planets and the moon and the sun all follow along the same track, because the solar system is very coplanar. It's a very flat plane. And one of the common things that I hear in astrology is something called retrograde. And if you pay attention to what Mars is doing, it's going to turn around and go backwards. And so I don't know if you guys can see Mars going backwards, but Mars would be in retrograde during this time. So retrograde means that it's moving backwards with respect to its normal yearly motion. And it's just for a little bit, and then it goes back into its regular prograde motion.
Yeah. Now it's not moving backwards. We just see that because we're sort of passing it up on the inside track. So because we're going faster and passing it up, it looks like it's receding back away from us. But yeah, retrograde is a big part of astrology.
Yeah, so I thought that visual was really nice
yeah, that's excellent
to demonstrate what the ecliptic is and where the zodiac signs came from, because the sky watchers of that culture were able to recognize where the sun was at a given time and what constellation, what group of stars was behind it at any given time of year.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was a really great visual. So I have one more student question, and then we'll go back to our set questions. Do people who believe in astrology consider it a religion or an ideology? And both of y'all can answer this one. Cameron, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Well, I think it depends on the person. It depends on that individual. There are folks who believe it as a religion. There are folks who think it's a fun hobby. There are folks who think it's somewhere in between, and there are folks who completely discount it. And again, this is, to me, amazingly similar to science fiction. There are people who will read, who do the transition from Robert Heinlein to L. Ron Hubbard, and they'll read his science fiction, and it's similar types of stories and things like that. I was more of a Heinlein fan than an L. Ron Hubbard fan. There are other folks who will worship Xenu, which is a character that L. Ron Hubbard came up with and is the central figure in Scientology. So people are people. There's a spectrum of these types of beliefs. There's folks that'll see it as a way to live your life. There's folks who will see it as, well, I guess it makes sense to me, but, I've got other stuff to worry about. There's folks who will see it as entertainment. There's folks who will see it as BS, and then folks who will completely ignore it. So, there's that really wide spectrum with people, but without a doubt, there are folks that view it as one of the oldest, most universal ancient religions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Steffanie, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, and I would say that honestly, my experience with astrology, that's kind of how I got interested in astronomy in the first place when I was younger, and the ways that I mentioned how they overlap and sort of the historical connections that they had was sort of the last time I really spent much time with astrology. And so I guess I don't really know how people respond to it or how most people view astrology. Because once I got hit by the astronomy bug, And I realized that that fuzziness that happens, a lot of people love that fuzziness. They go into the humanities and the arts. I like precision and clarity, and the fact that astronomy is very multidisciplinary. So I get to study a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of geology, a little bit of psychology too. There's a lot of computer programming, a lot of physics. I kind of never looked back once I got bit by the astronomy bug.
You both study a very interesting topic, that's for sure. Okay, so that concludes our student questions for now. We still have a few more minutes, so we'll be looking to see if any of these students add something into the comments, but if not, I do have a few more questions for you guys. So first off, and this is for either of you, can you describe what a birth chart is and what the different symbols and planets mean in regard to birth charts?
Not really.
No, it's okay.
Okay, so my understanding of a birth chart is that it shows the position of the planets and the sun, the moon, all the planets that we knew of with respect to the stars along the ecliptic. And so based on the time of day, and it depends on whether or not you're following using the axial precession that happened, because so for example, I'm an Aquarius and I've always believed myself to be an Aquarius, and I always check the Aquarius horoscopes, or at least I used to. But yeah, when I looked at using Stellarium, just the program that I just demonstrated, the sun was actually in Capricorn when I was born, and I don't even know what a Capricorn is like. I'm definitely not a Capricorn. And so if you're using the modern positions, it'll give you a different reading than if you were using the positions when Western astrology was set up 2,000 years ago. It's shifted about 20 degrees in the sky. And so there's a small chance that it would still be within that same zodiac constellation, but most people's zodiac signs have shifted one over from what they would have been 2,000 years ago if you had been born during that same month or during that same season. And so
that's exactly right. I mean, the star chart that is modernly made by astrologers for people is not actually where the position of those. It is the position of those things, but the stars aren't in the same place, and we're not oriented. The tilt of the planet is not oriented the same way. It's a fun little artifact, but it is, even whether you believe that those forces are there or those forces aren't there. The modern star chart is just, it's not accurate. It's not the position of where the suns and the sun, the planets and the moon were relative to today's stars. It may be relative to you, but I'm kind of the same thing. I was, I don't follow astrology, but I always thought I was a Libra. And then when I looked it up when I was in college, I'm actually a Virgo, and don't know the difference really between them. I don't think it affected my life, but I definitely know of people whose lives have been affected by that. And I think I pointed out that, right now there's 13 constellations. It's downright horrifying for some students to find out they're Ophukins. It really kind of changes their worldview. And, perhaps that's part of the growth process for some folks.
Yeah. So, I know I'm a Libra because I was told certain dates of the year you get assigned a zodiac sign, but you're saying that we have a more modern star chart now that is actually different than what's assigned?
Yeah, if you tell me your birthday, I can tell you what your actual sign is.
Sorry?
Just if you tell me what your birthday is, like the day and the month, I could tell you what where the sun was actually, where in the sky.
It's the 10th of October.
Let's see. So the 10th of October, you're a Virgo still.
Oh, I'm a Virgo, not a Libra.
Oh, were you a Libra?
Yeah,
you and I are on the same boat. I'm the 19th of October. I was always told I was a Libra, but Virgo actually goes till the 30th of October.
Okay.
Most of your Libras are now in November. So I was told I was a Libra and I'm a Virgo, and looks like you're in the same boat.
Yeah. So it looks like we have one student submission that's coming in right now, and they want to know where the sun was for June 11th. For June 11th.
Okay, so June 11th, your actual zodiacal sign would be Taurus. But June the 11th used to be Gemini.
Okay.
So if you were raised to believe you were a Gemini and had the whole duality thing going, and the Corsican empathy and all that, well, now and anyone can look these things up. You can actually do the simulation in Stellarium, or you could just look it up on the internet, and you can say, actual position of the star when I was born, or my real zodiacal sign, and about 1 out of 13 people will find out they're Ophukins, and most folks will find out they're something else.
I can actually share my screen real quick for that birth date if you want to see it.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be great.
Stellarium.
There's one slight adjustment you need to do if you actually want to do the position of the stars. And it's a very small adjustment, but you would also need the year as well. And it's an incredibly minor adjustment, but if you were going to give someone the actual sky image for their like the positions of the moons and the stars, those will be very different on January 3rd of one year and January 3rd of 19 years ago.
So this is where the sun was on, you said June 11th?
June 11th or July 19th.
Okay, so this is June 11th, and you can kind of make out the red boundary. So this would be in Taurus. Yeah. Is that what you said?
Yeah, they're currently a Taurus. They're right between the bull's horns, but traditionally they would be Gemini, which is just up the corner a little bit there.
And what was the July date?
19th.
Yeah. July 19th. And so this is for 2020. And yeah, like we're saying, it would be a little bit off.
By the year.
Yeah, July 19th?
Yes.
Looks like it's pretty close to the cusp between Gemini and Cancer.
What caused these shift?
The shift in the tilt of the Earth.
Okay.
So, the Earth has a particular tilt, and there's a really interesting archaeological story behind this too. When Egyptology became a thing for British and American explorers or tomb raiders, depending on your perspective, this was the 1800s, the mid 1800s, and so on and so forth. You had folks that would go, sort of loot these tombs and take all the stuff out, and it created a tremendous amount of interest in Europe and the United States on looking at Egyptian history and artifacts. Well, then the second wave were really more like scientists. There were archaeologists and anthropologists and so on, and they really discovered that the pyramids on the Giza Plateau and the Great Pyramid of Cheops, these had these really accurate stellar alignments to less than 1/4 of a degree, always less than within 1/2 a degree, to objects in the stars, like the belt stars of Orion and so on. There are these shafts in the pyramids and so on that would line up to certain stars that were part of their mythology, specifically the constellation of Orion, which was their god Osiris, and so on. But some of these stars were way out of whack. Like the central star, the star that they would orbit around. For instance, that's Polaris now, the North Star. Steffanie showed this really cool photo at Arches National Park where it was a night shot and you could see the stars rotating around like that. They were all going around the North Star, Polaris. And that's because that's the tilt of our Earth right now, and we're rotating around and the North Pole is pointing at Polaris. Well, some of these stars, some of these alignments, especially after the Rosetta Stone and so on, where you could read the hieroglyphics, were way off as much as 4 or 5 degrees. And for the longest time, archaeologists were baffled. In fact, if you read the archaeology, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was due to turmoil in the Middle Kingdom and the Late Kingdom, and one type of government in ancient Egypt supplanting another. Well, in the early 60s, some astronomers did some computer simulations. This is while some folks were attempting to understand climate cycles and ice ages. There's thing called the Milankovitch cycle that is determines the ice ages and so on. And those astronomers showed that the stars were in different places. In fact, the North Star was Vega. It was tilted way over on this part. And if you go ahead and put the position of the skies back to where they were 2,000, 2,500 years ago, then all those little slots in the pyramids do line up perfectly with the things that they were supposed to. So it's a really great interdisciplinary example of science where you have, astronomers and some of the earliest computational astronomers, folks who were doing, computer simulations of the night sky and the ephemeris. And then, this rich history of archaeology, where folks went and took accurate measurements and tried to make sense of that data, coming together to really explain what happened. It's one of those little sort of cool historical science, interdisciplinary science stories.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to jump to our final question. So to conclude, what is one thing you want people to know about astronomy and astrology? Steffanie, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So one thing that I want people to know about astronomy and astrology is that the practice of astrology really built the foundations for astronomy, and we're really indebted as a science and astronomy to that practice of astrology. So I do have a tremendous amount of respect for the history of the combined astronomy and astrology. But it was really the pursuit for credibility and rigor that caused the separation, and the observation and experiments have to be the ultimate authorities of any claim. And if we make claims without strong evidence, that then falls into the realm of pseudoscience.
Yeah, my thing, and if I've seemed a little harsh on astronomy or astrology, it's kind of my perspective. But the thing I want to leave folks with is, you're free to believe in whatever you want to believe. No one should impose their viewpoint on anyone else. My only caution is look before you leap. Try to get as much information as you can, especially if you're going to live your life by a particular creed or a particular viewpoint or perspective. I don't think that they're incompatible with each other, just like I don't think, Star Wars and Star Trek are incompatible with each other, or neither of those is incompatible with physics. I think they can make for a very rich, entertaining life. Of course, people will believe in different things. People are free to believe in different things. My answer to that would be enjoy it, do what floats your boat. But, just be careful if the decisions that you choose to make are based on things that are less substantiated than other types of decision based on other types of information. Ultimately, your life is yours to lead, but you can actually make choices that are based on, a stronger, more reliable foundational basis. That's it. That would be my imparting bit of wisdom to folks tuning in.
Well, I would like to give a huge thank you to both of our panelists today. You have made this hot topic very educational and very informative. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope the viewers enjoyed listening in as well. If you liked this live stream, you're in luck because we have more upcoming hot topic events. Next up will be Fact or Fiction Government Conspiracies on September 17th, followed by voting in the Electoral College on October 7th. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram to stay updated with reminders for all of the cool events we have planned this semester. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.